My favourite part of teaching Australian history is that we've always had a really unique identity and disposition.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. In the past 2 decades, we've witnessed the dramatic decline in the study of Australian history at both schools and universities. Australians apparently aren't really interested in learning about their own national story. Indeed, the subject Australian history is only offered in one state, the state of Victoria. And enrolments in this subject have been falling year on year. There are now just 36 schools offering the subject, with just 430 students taking it in 2024. Now, to give you a bit of a contrast here, students are attracted to studying history, but they prefer revolutions. Think the Russian, the American and the French. And the revolution subject attracts 10 times the number of schools offering it and more than 10 times the number of students taking the subject. Now, this lack of interest in our own national story contributes as well to a decline in basic understanding of civics. 72% of students failed the civics and citizenship test last year, so we've got a major problem on our hand. It also, I argue, leads to the erosion in the quality of our political discourse, as there is so little historical context provided in our national debates. But amidst all this doom and gloom, there are some little rays of sunshine that could give us hope for the future. Some teachers and schools are fighting a rearguard action to defend what's left of the study of Australian history, taking on new courses and encouraging others to do likewise. So it's worth asking, how do we rekindle a love of Australian history? Well, joining me today is someone who works at the front line of this important work. Tania Ragusa is a history, English and religion teacher at Mercy College in Coburg, and that's in Melbourne, Victoria. This is a school which recently made the switch back to one of these least popular subjects, VCE Australian History. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Tania.
Thank you so much, Georgina, for having me.
Well, Tania, you're teaching history, English and religion. You, I presume, have a love of history. Where did that come from? Is that connected to a personal story or just love this country and love the stories that formed it?
Yeah, funnily enough, I can't really pinpoint where it came from. I mean, I love my family, but they weren't historians themselves. All I know is that it was always innate. The earliest memory I have of myself engaging in history was 6 or 7 years old, looking at books of ancient Egypt. And it's funny when you look back on your life and you realise there was hints of what you were always destined to become in a way. I didn't think about teaching history back then. And then here I am 20 so plus years later and I'm teaching history. So it's always felt innate. It's always a subject I've naturally gravitated towards. And I love pretty much every aspect of teaching it too.
What do you find the students' reaction to history is like? I mean, they have to do some history up to year 10 and then after that it's optional and clearly very optional. Not many take it, particularly Australian history. But is there a curiosity? Is there a great interest?
There is. I find that students fall into 2 camps. The first camp is I love history, particularly European history, and especially in those middle years of 7 to 10 when they're entering senior secondary schooling, they love being able to delve into those typical topics of World War I, World War II, the Cold War. You have the other camp of students that say, I can't write. They often equate history with writing and that deeper analysis. And some of them do say it's just not for me. But you do have a large contingent of students that love history. They love discussing particularly international affairs. They're very in tune with what's happening in the world. And I think they see how history helps them understand current events. But I can't say that I've often heard students, coming to me and being excited about Australian history particularly. They're often very in touch with what's happening internationally and what's in the news and the international coverage of events, but not really grounded in Australian history per se.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of interesting reasons why that is. One of the, I think, really interesting observations is how the teaching of history has changed. I think of my lifetime, so through the 80s, 90s, obviously noughties, and now into today, into the 2020s. Really, really different. Like when you're in the 80s, it was very little First Nations history, of course, very much about Captain Cook and Arthur Phillip and the colonial era, yes. But European history was still very much a focus, British history particularly. And that emphasis of learning the dates, the key personalities and the rote learning. I mean, we seem to have gone completely away from that, probably for the better, although you do need a basic core of knowledge in order to be able to engage with primary sources, secondary sources, and then develop your theories of why events happened and how social change or economic change took place.
Yeah, I could say I resonate with that, with your description. I think there is a focus on highlighting the Australian perspective. We still look at European events. I can only speak from secondary schooling curriculum, but the early years of year 7 and 8 still engage with ancient history. You look at the major ancient civilizations, you look at the Middle Ages, the Renaissance. You're still engaging with European history, but there is that Australian lens now of let's look at ancient Australia, let's look at deep time Aboriginal history. When we look at World War I and World War II, it was what was Australia's response to the conflict and Australia's alliances that developed. So I guess you are still within those familiar events, but definitely more highlighting the Australian experience, Australian participation and perspectives. I think as well the focus has shifted away from just being able to recall events to really engaging in the debate itself between different perspectives, between different sources, between different groups. I'm finding that the key word that I see in curriculum nowadays is competing perspectives. Can you identify the competing perspectives on a particular event that happened? What were people feeling and how were they on opposite sides of the spectrum? And using source material to obviously bring those perspectives to light. I feel like that's the focus now.
Do you think there's something about the way we tell the Australian story and stories that makes it less interesting than, say, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, American Revolution, I don't know, the War of the Roses, and look, it's really, 100 Years War.
It is really hard to compete with some of those events. Unfortunately, we haven't reached the heights of the terror of the French Revolution that students find so naturally gory and interesting, or the Bolsheviks of the Russian Revolution. Some historical events do lend itself to that more dramatic retelling where they're gripped by the historical narrative. I do think those students are not silly in the sense that they can see when a certain history is trying to be framed. They don't want the romanticised version of Australian history. They want to know what were the realities. Were we in the wrong here? Were we in the right? And that question of have we always been on the right side of history? They are very quick to criticise when they see a depiction of Australian history that seems manufactured. And I think they just want the reality of it. They don't want the mythologised version of Australian history. And I think that's what disengages them at times. If you can give them the reality of it, the different perspectives, the conflicts, the tensions, the drama, that's what they're engaged in.
I wonder, though, whether that approach opens up this real issue, I think, with history when we look at it with our 2026 values and mores, that we can't actually then put ourselves in the position of someone in 1913 or 1813 or, 1613, that, their values were different. The way they saw the world was different. It doesn't mean that they were inherently evil. They just came from a different time. In 200 years' time, people will look back at us and probably think we were morally bankrupt and, we would disagree because of the nature of our society is the one we live in now. We are here in the present. But this sort of idea that you view history without that context and that sort of empathy for the people of the era and try and play out those battles with your present day values and understanding too. Doesn't that kind of, I guess, diminish the lessons you can learn because you'll always feel morally superior to your forebears?
It actually reminds me of a conversation I had with my students recently. We look at a lot of prime ministers and governments and cabinets throughout our study of Australian history, And I did have to have this conversation with them in saying that there's a lot of criteria to determining whether a historical event was inherently positive or negative or progressive or conservative, in that you have to base it in the context of the time, and you have to understand that the context stipulated the way in which they acted and all the things that they valued, all the things that they were wanting. So it is a conversation that I have had to have with my students, in that, yes, we can still use our current values and morals and beliefs to understand history. That's still a valid lens, but you can't use that at the neglect of the contextual understanding of what was happening at the time as well.
It reminds me of a skit I saw, and I'm not going to remember the film it comes from. It's a comedy sketch, and it's of some German soldiers in the sort of trenches, and they're, discussing the battle. And then one of them, the more junior soldier, looks at the more senior one and sort of says, "Oh, Hans, are we the baddies?"
Yeah.
Sort of, oh, well, maybe we aren't on the right side of history here. But, I mean, even in the moments, there is a moment for reflection of people in the time. But,
Definitely.
that shows that there is context, and it's important, I think, that students understand those contexts.
Yeah, definitely.
Getting back to how we tell our own story, we rely, of course, on our professional historians, our academic historians, our historians who write biographies or books about major events. You've obviously read a lot of history as a history teacher. Who's your favourite Australian historian?
I can't say I have a singular favourite. I feel like the first thing I always do when I walk into a bookstore is head straight to the Australian history bookshelf. And I just love looking at the range of names that I recognise, because in the pursuit of teaching Australian history, you see those familiar names pop up in your textbook. The real seminal historians of Australian history, when it comes to colonisation, it's Richard Broome and Henry Reynolds. You'll see their name everywhere. I'm really loving David Hunt's perspective on history. I know he's been on the podcast.
Yeah, very funny.
And I that's what I love about his work, particularly when you're teaching young students. I love the way that he weaves comedy and narrative writing into his historical work. I always use his videos to introduce my Australian course at the beginning of the year. He talks about the oddness of our foundations and how we've always had this naturally larrikin nature to us, and that's made us unique to the rest of the world. We've never taken ourselves too seriously, to be honest. So I always engage with his work, particularly with students. I mean, there's great academics here at the University of Melbourne too. One of my old tutors I used to be a student here at the University of Melbourne, Dr. Liam Byrne, is now doing a lot of great work. He's a union historian, but I just love the way he pushes out history to the masses. He's got online blogs, Substacks, really modern uses of technology to present his historical work, videos that students can easily access. Claire Wright's doing a lot of great work at the moment. I use some of her documentaries on the female suffrage movement. So many names. I've noticed you've got Christina Twomey's book here, and you've had her on as well.
Yeah, about POWs, yeah.
She's featured heavily in our textbooks, particularly when it comes to the female suffrage movement and how federation was an opportunity for women. So I think she looks more just generally at the women's movement. So many key names of Australian history.
That's very reassuring, and we're pleased to be part of the work in publishing books on Australian history. Do you find it harder to teach Australian history to children of migrants or migrant children? Because, these sort of, say, David Hunt's, a lot of his stories are about colonial Australia, and, I mean, yes, that's sort of the basis of our society and our values, the egalitarianism, the larrikinism, irreverence, that, we were pretty tolerant and pluralistic, coming from all walks of the United Kingdom and Ireland, basically. But we were labourers through to, business people through to some aristocracy coming out to Australia. And for, I guess, an Australian who's been here multi-generation, you might have personal connections back to, you maybe have forebears who are convicts or free settlers. But for someone who's literally just migrated to Australia 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there must be a disconnect with these stories, aside from the fact that they are, of course, living on this land.
Definitely. I think they bring a rich perspective to the study of Australian history. Of course, we have migrant students who are so appreciative of the way that Australia has taken them in and their family in through years of perhaps hardship or refuge or asylum. We also have migrant students who've experienced discrimination on our Australian shores. And so I always like to tap into their experiences, and that's where the history classroom allows for that discussion. Once again, the key catchphrase is competing perspectives. And it's okay for migrants to also have both perspectives. It's okay for them to resonate with both sides of this understanding of Australian history.
I talked in my introduction about revolutions being the popular history subject. So it's good that there is a history subject that is popular.
Yeah, it's always great to see students engage in senior secondary history.
Indeed, even if it is French history, goodness me. but I mean, why is it that revolutions is so popular in Australian history is basically 10% of revolutions in terms of schools that offer it and students that study it? Is it the blood and gore? Is it the ideological battles? Is it the fact that society was completely upended and a new system of government introduced? I mean, is it the drama?
I mean, that's the question we've been trying to answer myself. Many teachers in Victoria, particularly, who are aware of this trend towards revolutions. It's hard to know. I think historically it's always been a subject that has garnered interest. The theatre of the revolution is really engaging for students. And like I said, some of the heights of the French Revolution or even the American Revolution, which has now been memorialised in musicals like Hamilton, which are so popular with our student base. So many kids love that. It is hard to compete with it at times. I do think as well, the more that it gathers momentum, it is harder to then sway the needle or get the needle ticking the other way. It is a subject where the more that you enrol in it, the more resources that are available and the wider the teacher support networks and the circles that you can engage in to seek support. I think as well there's an inherent misunderstanding of what Australian history is too. And when I begin this course with my Year 12 students at the beginning of the year, I always say I consider Australia the fifth revolution because it is a story of power and resistance and developing a nation and how people challenged authority and tried to create a new world. And it's when you get them thinking along those lines that they start to see, okay, maybe this does fit in with what we envisioned revolutions to be. Perhaps the title is just slightly different to the subject. So, I mean, there's so many great paths to revolutions. You just have to make them see it through the Australian lens now.
Do you think, though, we've suffered from treating our history as derivative? And by that I mean, early on we were British subjects and a lot of the teaching in Australia would have come from teachers who were, or academics who were taught in Britain, who studied in Britain, bringing British textbooks here. There wasn't much of a publishing industry in Australia, so you would have to get books from the UK. So this sort of idea that our history is just a kind of an appendage to Britain, and we originally saw it that way and have struggled to get out of that. And so this Eurocentric history, obsession too, that you say we love the world wars, which really were fought on European soil. We have a fascination with revolutions. Well, the two we were discussing are basically European revolutions. Obviously the Americans not, but I mean they were seeking independence from the British. So is there a derivativeness that makes us seem that our history is minimal?
Almost like a footnote in British history. Yeah. I do think that plays a part. I do think a lot of the course now is looking at how we actually established ourselves as independent of Britain throughout the years and how our own history begs its own questions separate to Britain. I do think people often see Australia, given the way that we play out on the world stage, perhaps we're not as important as other countries or superpowers in the world. So I try to bring that to prominence and I try to show just how connected we are to global networks or organisations or with our alliances, our treaties. Those are all things we study. Yeah, it is an interesting question. I don't know whether we'll ever be able to overcome that derivative status or that footnote status because it is hard to ignore. But I do like to cherish our own unique history too, and the way I think my favourite part of teaching Australian history is that we've always had a really unique identity and disposition. I feel like there's always been a unique Australian disposition in the way that we've approached conflict or the way that we've approached the foundations of the nation or the way that we've engaged in, historical debate. So I like to focus on those parts.
One thing when I think of British history or American history, French, Russian, is the importance of individuals. that there's a hero, there's a villain, there's a freedom fighter and the like. And I wonder in Australian history that we have in the past had some heroes, unlikely heroes. I mean, people, really looked up to Ned Kelly, bizarrely. You had, people used to really admire Captain Cook and Arthur Phillip. We would like to think they admired Bob Menzies. But there's, I think, a lack in Australia of focusing on the individuals who shaped our history and more these sort of trends and changes that give us a bit of a disconnect, and that perhaps if we had a focus more on the individual stories and the power of an individual to change society, the country, that would be more appealing to young people.
That's an interesting take. I can see merits to both sides of the argument.
Like, where's our Alexander Hamilton?
Where's the heroic...
The Henry Parks.
Yeah. Well, but that's why I love teaching this course, because perhaps students do have this assumption that there hasn't been that one singular figure who's defined our history. And in discovering this course in a bit more depth, they do discover that those individuals existed. They do look at the leaders of the movements, the various movements that we study. I do like to think, though, there's merit in understanding our history through the eyes of the collective, because I think that is what defines Australia. It is our collective movement. It has been our unity at times, and the movement that has grown. I just came from a lesson where I taught about the women's liberation movement just earlier today and how that really mass mobilised thousands of women. And I don't think it's any discredit to not identify a single leading woman as part of that movement. I think there is power in the collective, and I think Australia has always been a country that's valued that.
So when a student goes through high school, so 7, 8, 9, 10, obviously 11 and 12 is VCE, or depending on the state you are in, they have to do compulsory history, starting with, and I've had children through to year 9. I haven't had the year 10 curriculum yet, but I've seen this, you have ancient history, Middle Ages, and then Industrial Revolution, British colonisation, this sort of, I guess, Federation era history. By year 10, you are getting to the World War I, World War II, migration, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander civil land rights movement in Australia. But by the time you get to the end of year 10, students are just not continuing with it. Is it because what we are offering them in those earlier years are they sick of it by the end? Are they thinking, no more, thanks, please? I can't.
Honestly, it is something that I've had to think about when I have thought about this question and contemplated upon this question and tried to inspire other teachers to take on Australian history. That is one of the things that comes up. Are students fatigued by the time they get to year 10? Because it is evident across every year. There is some element of Australian history that's explored, or connection to Australia via our proximal neighbours. So, for example, Polynesia or Indonesia or China. So you do wonder whether by the end of the year 10 they're fatigued and they're like, done, dusted, and I can move on to other areas that I haven't studied before. It is something that I don't have the answer for. It's the answer that I've been searching for. I hope that they're not too fatigued, but I do still emphasise the value of continuing it in VCE once they do get to year 11 and 12, because I think the maturity of the discussion that can happen at year 11 and 12 vastly differs from the kinds of historical skills and concepts you're engaging in at year 7 and 8. And particularly as students edge towards 18, when they start to feel themselves a bit more a part of the political process and engaging in democracy a bit more actively, is how is this proximal to my life? How is this actually going to impact the future decisions I make when I do have to submit my vote or engage in discussion or hear news stories, interpret the budget, which is very topical at the moment. All these things that occur on our calendar year, I think by the time they get to VCE, that's where Australian history can be revisited and say, okay, let's make the connection now. You've learnt all the basics, but now let's really see how our lives are shaped by it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's so important, that skill of seeing the historical context in all these contemporary debates, that, even tax policy doesn't just come out of nowhere. Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, doesn't just announce what the tax system is going to be like today without any reference to what's been tried in the past, even politically what has worked and what hasn't. We've just had debates about broken election promises because certain policies were announced in the budget were tried at elections before and had proved to be unpopular, and now they're going to try them again, and, well, I guess they'll see at the next election how popular they are or not. But without an understanding of Australian history, what impact do you think it has on students' ability to sort of enter the world as adults? You know, obviously they might go to uni, but they might not. But as voters, as just educated, engaged members of our democracy.
It is one of my major concerns. It's the reason why I pushed this sort of senior secondary education in Australian history. My biggest fear is a total disillusionment and disengagement with the political process. Polling, and I know that institutes in Canberra and national institutes already do research into election trends and voter trends, and we can already see that the nature of how people engage in politics is changing, and so much of that comes from understanding the history as well. Understand that a lot of politics is grounded in our Australian history. So for me, it's how well can we fully engage in our democratic processes if we don't understand the origins of it. I'm hoping that it doesn't lead towards a trend of perhaps anti-establishment or those sort of more radical pipelines where people totally don't see the value in our democracy or the institutions that we have. There are so many concerns that I'm trying to sort of actively work against in providing students with this civics education.
I mean, this is where a subject like revolutions, I guess, comes in handy, because you can show what happens when people get sick of the establishment and say no more. I mean, it can lead to massive violence, massive disruption, complete and utter social, economic chaos. You know, you might say, oh, well, America was the better for it in the end, but there was a lot of bloodshed, and, you know, I would argue that Australia avoided a revolution by getting the same outcome, an independence from Britain, our own federation, but without all the bloodshed. And we got a great political system, I think, that has stood, well, the test of time, 125 years this year.
And that's another narrative that I try and dispel. I don't know. I mean, I've seen varying iterations of it, how much our students value our democracy in Australia. And perhaps it's because they might see it as trivial or not as expansive as other democracies around the world, or not as impressive as other democracies around the world. But the way in which we've been able to establish certain processes, policies, even the secret ballot was invented in Victoria.
It used to be called the Australian ballot.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think unpacking just how radical we were considered a social laboratory at one point where we were experimenting with these new things. I think showing the value in our institutions, and we're not just trivial, we're not just this small island floating in the middle of the ocean, in that we have had a major role to play, and getting them to see the value of that and be proud of that as well. There are aspects of our democracy that we can be intensely proud of. One of my students recounted today that she couldn't believe that protest is just so accepted here in Australia, because it is an inherent freedom and a civil liberty that we have here, and how tolerant we are of that.
It's interesting you use the word our democracy is seen as not impressive, and I wondered what you meant by that. I mean, I was sort of guessing, was it because we don't have a presidential system like the United States, where basically an individual is running the show. You have the Trump administration, the Biden administration, the Bush, the Clinton. Like, these are whole kind of eras of America that are defined by the individual. And I guess that comes back to my earlier question about, are we doing ourselves a disservice when we don't focus on the individual? We don't, for example, talk about Alfred Deakin, the person, and what he was able to deliver. I mean, not to say there weren't other people involved. Of course there were, and I agree there's an importance of the sort of collective effort in Australia too. But if you don't focus on the individual, you sort of cede the space to countries that do in the telling of their story. And I think potentially we need a bit more of the great man and woman version of history in Australia to inspire our young people.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, that could be perfectly plausible. There is something naturally intriguing around the personality of politics, and hence why we do gravitate towards more presidential systems, even in discussions that students have. Like I said, they're very well aware of what's happening in the US or in Europe and elections that are happening abroad. They seem to be following international elections more and more, as I've noticed over the past few years. Perhaps there is room for really highlighting the heroes of Australian history or just the leaders of Australian history. There is current exploration of that, but to say that there's been a singular person is quite hard because we have had such a diverse and vast history. Maybe that's something we can take into the course and see if we can increase enrolments and boost the popularity.
Yeah. I mentioned in the introduction that 72% of students failed the civics and citizenship test. I mean, that's catastrophic. That's really, really worrying. But since 2004, so 22 years, there's not been a single year in which more than 50% of students passed this test. I don't know if I ever did this test. I finished school in the late 90s, so perhaps I don't know, maybe it didn't exist. Maybe 2004 was when it first started. But, I mean, is the test just too hard? That's one question. Or is there just something fundamentally wrong with how we're teaching kids about civics and citizenship that means they just aren't able to answer these questions that perhaps we think are really, the basic building blocks of how our political system works, our democracy works?
It's an interesting question to ask. I think there are a variety of ways to look at this. We are asking students to understand really complex institutions and systems in Australia. At Year 7 and 8, we asked them to understand as part of the curriculum the role of the High Court and the function of the Australian Constitution in enacting political change. They're not easy concepts to grasp. We look at parts of the Constitution as well. So, yes, we are asking them to grapple with some pretty intense political ideas and parliamentary institutions. Perhaps it's the way it's being delivered. Is it being delivered in a way that it's applicable to their lives? Are we using case studies that they're engaged in? Are we showing that civics can be taught in a variety of ways? What about using simulation as a form of teaching civics? I know once they get to Year 9, they have to understand the functioning of the courts and how are we delivering that content to them. It could be a variety of things. Perhaps the link between their own lives is what's missing and how I'm actually a citizen and I display citizenship in my own life and I show that I engage with the rights and responsibilities of civic life. Perhaps that's the missing link. I mean, I'm very confident that civics and history teachers today are doing a great job in trying to build that link and trying to make it more relevant so that they can take that knowledge away and apply it in a different context. But yeah, all difficult questions that we're still answering and we're still trying to get to the root of.
Is the test hard?
I don't think it's referring to an actual standardised test. I think what it's referring to is students' ability to meet the different points within the curriculum using NAPLAN perhaps or other forms of standardised testing. Once students get to senior secondary school and in Victoria, they also complete a general achievement test, which does look at some aspects of humanities. So I think they're using a range of sources. There's not one standardised civics test. I think this is more perhaps with the sample size and what students were able to show and not show.
Yeah. Well, I have just experienced my Year 7 going through civics and citizenship module in her humanities subject, and it did seem quite difficult actually. A 12-year-old trying to understand about the separation of powers and the independence of the judiciary and checks and balances. These are probably issues that even a 25-year-old would struggle to give a quick definition to. Now, Tania, your school, Mercy College, actually introduced the subject Australian history recently. So you're bucking the trend. You're not abandoning it.
Trying.
How did you go about this and what were the challenges?
So the conversation arose in 2022. We found that there was an initial dip in the humanities-based subjects in general. But as we were heading into 2021 and 2022, we found that general interest in the humanities was starting to increase again. And it became increasingly clear to us that we would be able to offer larger class sizes of senior history. So we started to think about what kind of history we wanted to deliver as we were getting into the later years of year 11 and 12. We were also a school that had previously run revolutions, and that was our tradition for many, many years. And then after not having taught history for a few years, we were able to start fresh in many ways. And I was really fortunate to have a great leadership team and great humanities leaders that offered me a bit of creative freedom here in what history we wanted to teach. And as a collective, we decided that Australian history seemed like the best option on a variety of fronts, and that we could really make this an interesting subject and a desirable subject that 3 years later I've been able to sustain a class for.
And you don't teach revolutions then? This is the only history subject you teach at VCE?
The only history subject. There are certain subjects that you can teach at year 11. So we teach a modern history course at year 11. And then in year 12, Australian history is the only history offering we have, yes.
And how do you sell this to your students? You've got a year 10 student coming up. You want them to do, I guess, modern history and then go on to Australian history. What's the conversation you're having?
Yeah, you do have to market it. When it gets to subject selection time in the middle of the year and students have to consider the following year, it does turn into a bit of a marketing ploy. For Australian history, I came through the lens of a few main points. Firstly is you've already got a lot of contextual knowledge. This is stuff that you've studied from year 7 to 10. We're just about to explore in a bit more detail and also uncover some new things that you haven't looked at before. So there's also that element of excitement that there are things that I'm still yet to learn. But I found that particularly for schools that perhaps students aren't meeting a certain literacy level, or perhaps the literacy demands of VC revolutions might be quite hard. Australian history offers that level of accessibility because it's also lived history too. So in being able to access textbook experts or additional readings, they can also rely on parents and families to recount the history to them, engage in historical conversation with other people in Australia. Perhaps they've heard about it in their own lives before. So I found that there was various access points for students to learn the content, and it wasn't grounded in that really academic pre-reading that other subjects might beg. And I also like to sort of highlight the trends between different subjects. I found that Australian history is the perfect connection between politics and legal studies, which are also offered at a VC level. There's so many links in terms of the kinds of skills that they have to exhibit, things like cause, consequence, significance, using sources, reading sources. That's a similar trend across all three subjects. And then just the interplay and the overlapping of information. You know, in legal studies at a VCE level, they do look at things like the referendum process, and we study that in Australian history. So they get it from more of a political process lens, and then also the history behind, for example, the 1967 referendum, which is a key event that we look at.
Obviously, you'll be aware of the history wars in Australia. You know, John Howard saying we shouldn't have a black armband
white blindfold,
of history, that we should look on Australian history more proudly, more kindly, rather than see it as all bad. And there's that sort of sense that there's an illegitimacy to the British settlement and then the colonisation of Australia. Do you find that leaning into culture war issues is helpful? So, I mean, for example, debates over Australia Day, debates over Anzac Day, you know, maybe there's some industrial action, a big strike. You could link those things back to events in Australian history or changes in Australian society that came out of very similar sorts of action.
It's definitely a great reference point for students to see how certain events might be applicable to the future. As a teacher, I have to take into consideration, you know, some restrictions and barriers, and in terms of my own professionalism as well. So as long as the classroom remains apolitical and impartial, we can engage with those debates by looking at the competing perspectives, but ultimately it's up to the students to take on whatever side that they agree with. We don't necessarily engage in the debate itself. It's more of an analysis of the different arguments and where those viewpoints are originating from, and that's where we go back in time to Australian history and where these sort of ideas originated from. But yeah, you do have to also walk a fine line, because any history teacher would know that opening up the classroom to a sort of cultural war or debate can be a task you have to tread lightly with. But you can also approach it with a degree of curiosity in let's understand why people have these views and where are the sources that show us these views, and approach it as more of a historical task.
So what is Australian history at a VCE level? What would a student get?
They get a lot of option and variety. So the Australian history course at VCE is split into 4 areas of investigation, and schools have the option of choosing 2 of those to study in depth. So if there's an area that perhaps your student body might not be as interested in or doesn't really appeal to your demographic, you completely disregard them and really tailor the course towards student interest or voice or, the kinds of students that you have in front of you. It covers everything from themes of environmentalism and relationship to land, from the eras of custodianship and Aboriginal deep time all the way to the Anthropocene today. There's other themes of migration and how you create a nation and different arguments around race, immigration, national identity. There's other topics about power and resistance when you're looking at who has governed throughout different times in Australian history and who's resisted that governance, challenges to authority and protest. And then finally, there's an opportunity to study, if you are interested, in Australia's experiences of war and global conflict. So there's something for everyone. You don't have to study all of those, though.
Yeah. Oh, it sounds very interesting. It does sound, though, that a lot of it is political.
It is inherently. The two are intertwined. It's hard to separate. Yeah.
So I guess the question I have is, do students who might be sort of a bit sick of politics find Australian history a bit too close to home and therefore try and avoid it? I wonder if that's a bit of a problem. Obviously, there are students who are massively politically engaged and love it. But for the students who think, politics, it's really hard, it's, people fighting and I can't be bothered, that then there's a reluctance to get into Australian history because it is so inherently political.
I'm lucky I've never experienced that with the students who do select it. I'm sure
they're probably all the politics kids.
Yeah, and the ones that aren't interested are probably the ones that aren't choosing the subject because they know the inherent link. You can still look at it from just a narrative lens as well. So much of Australian history is you need to have a grasp of the narrative. And if you're someone that just likes to engage in the storytelling of it, you can also find pleasure in that too.
Yeah. We're based here in Melbourne. You're up in Coburg in the north of Melbourne, and we're based here at the University of Melbourne, just above the CBD. This university is historical. It's been here for 180 years. I think
it's
170. Course. Yeah, it's an incredible institution.
Definitely.
Walking around Melbourne, you can see a lot of leftover remnants of the gold rush era, obviously migrant history. Go to Lygon Street, it's full of Italian migrants or probably the grandchildren of them these days. Other parts of Melbourne have different migrant stories as well. You can go down to Royal Exhibition Buildings. It just celebrated the 125th anniversary of the sitting of the first federal parliament.
Yes, I did see that.
Because, of course, the Canberra Parliament, now old Parliament House, wasn't built until the 1920s, 1927 I think it was. But, how much do you lean into local history in your teaching of Australian history, and is that helpful?
It's something that I've leaned into more over the past year. Last year I tried to make a really conscious effort to show students just how close they are to the history that they're studying. And that was another way to market the subject, that yes, you can study Europe and that's great, and one day you might be able to travel to Europe and see those things, but really you're unaware of the way in which the streets you walk or the street names you see or the stations that are being built are all intertwined into the narrative that you're studying. So last year I made very conscious efforts to immerse students into life in the CBD. We traversed different laneways and statues and buildings and even monuments that are just scattered throughout the CBD, and all of a sudden you see their eyes illuminate in terms of, I've walked past these streets or these monuments multiple times and yet I've never actually understood how our story is intertwined here or how it's a seminal part of the course that we're studying. Once students see, I think there's a sense of satisfaction that I'm here walking in this certain place I've got access to a history that perhaps other people walking by are not conscious of. And I think they really like that satisfaction of, it's like I've got access to this hidden world that other people might not be privy to. And I found that once I started to engage students in a bit more place-based learning is when engagement really soared, and they started to report back to me, oh, Miss, I went here on the weekend, or, I also saw this out in my community, or did you know that this place is also linked? I found that it just opened up the world to them in a different way.
Do you think other countries do this better? I mean, you can go to London, I think, or Rome, Italy is just sort of dripping with history, and they really hammered up this is where, so-and-so lived. Across the UK, they have those blue plaques everywhere. Literally every second house seems to be a prominent person lived there or was born there or wrote there or whatever. I mean, we have it to an extent, but I don't know whether we are out and proud about our history as much as we could be, and whether that doesn't then engender a curiosity about the buildings and monuments and the place names around us and how they're connected to our past.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I was thinking about how lucky it would be to live in Europe, and, every street corner is a different historical monument or site. I do think we are quite modest. Australians in nature are quite modest, and so the way that we display our history or exhibit certain things or places is a little bit humble in nature. It's there though, and I think that's where the intrigue comes, is like you need to search for it. Yes, we can have the plaques everywhere, but I also think there's something really cool about not having a plaque there, but you're standing on historical ground, and you can see the hints of it and the remnants of it. I think as well with historical thinking, you teach students to engage in historical skills and concepts every day, and how historical thinking is an active thought process. And by deducing certain things about an environment or seeing certain hints or clues that they can gather that this is a historical space is really an interesting process for them. So yes, you can have the plaques and you can have the signs and you can have it, like you said, like London, the little blue signs everywhere. But I also think there's value in having to deduce it as well.
Well, food for thought, Tania, and well done on bringing Australian history back to Mercy College. Thank you so much for your efforts, and great to have this discussion.
Thank you so much, Georgina. It was a pleasure chatting with you today.
History matters because ideas matter. Thank you for listening to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. To follow more of our work, subscribe to the podcast and visit robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. I'm Georgina Downer. Until next time.